about this picture, they vertically stretched it to make me look thinner. They needed to take another headshot, but I have two options. I can take a fat headshot, or I can lose some weight to try to look like the old ones that I'm focused on. So, I'm going to set a timer here. If I go over, you blame Inovatec. Cutting into my time here. Give me just a moment. Put a timer on, something that preachers in my churches growing up never did. All right, and this is my clicker. I assume the green arrow is this good. All right. Okay, normally, it's common for speakers to do some type of icebreaker, self-deprecating jokes. And I'm from Texas. I grew up a Texas Southern Baptist. For those of you who may not know, Baptists have a number of scruples, puritanical scruples, notably no alcohol. I've managed to overcome that. But so what's very common knowledge is Baptists will often, many of them will observe these as long as another Baptist is watching. So if I was doing a presentation in Texas, my self-deprecating joke would be, why should you always take two Baptists with you fishing? If you take one, he'll drink all your beer. Well, I'm not in Texas, I'm in Canada. So here goes. A Canadian and American walk into a bar. The Canadian sees the bar and ducks. The American hits the bar, conks him on the head, and he's passed out because he was spending all his time talking about himself and how great his country is. So the other one is, now you have to laugh at some of these or I'm going to have to dig deep and make orange man jokes. The other one is the Canadian and American walk into a bar. The Canadian is taken to the hospital where he gets great health care and he leaves without paying a cent. The American is taken to the hospital, doesn't have any health insurance, and he goes bankrupt. So. I'm going to stop there so we can actually get through this presentation. All right. Most of anything useful I have to say is captured in this slide right here. My agenda today, I'm going to talk about what you don't know can hurt you. There's an English writer in the 16th century, George Parry, who had a famous novel where he said, you know, what I know if not, hurteth me not. Most of us know that that's not really correct. Ignorance is not always bliss. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to talk about it in the sense that what you aren't looking for, what you aren't managing with enough time to have an impact on it, is going to cost you your business very, very possibly. And we've seen over the last couple of years, a number of lenders have gone under. There's some smart people, there's some people with great models, there's some people with fantastic experience in the industry that are no longer here. And so what you don't know can hurt you. We're going to talk about the credit ecosystem. It's not all about what you're doing in the walls of your own building, but there are a number of factors that are going to come into play, and it's important to be cognizant of those when you're managing. Then we're going to talk about the problem of credit scotoma. I'll explain that in a moment. And then we want to look ahead to next year. There's a lot of interesting information, charts and graphs, but at the end of the day, what are you going to do with that information? If it's not something practical that you can deploy in your own shop, then it's not doing you much good. So on to this. What you don't know can hurt you. It's a very famous Far Side cartoon about boys playing with a bear cub. The actual tagline of that was, "And the Anderson brothers were never seen again." But performance is influenced by a number of things in this credit ecosystem. You know, when we model credit, when we do a predictive model, we say, I have good and bad loans, and I have a bunch of data that I'm using, you know, hopefully from one of the fine vendor partners here today, such as DMS and others. We have this fantastic data, and we're modeling the event of whether they pay us back or not, or you might be modeling recovery. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that influence that. Think about it in the same way you would, the same approach that a meteorologist would take. It's a lot of competing factors that we have to simulate together and say, what's the outcome? So as you know, credit is influenced by a number of things. Underwriting and servicing strategy, how you buy paper, how you respond to competitive pressures, how you service that paper will impact your credit performance. We're going to go into a little more detail on these given time. Seasonality. You know, in the fourth quarter, we're trying to compete with Santa Claus to get customers to pay their car loan. And so delinquency and losses are often higher in the fourth quarter. That also affects vintage performance. I fund loans from a particular vintage, a cohort in time, a monthly or quarterly vintage. And depending on what time of year those are funded, the seasonality will have an impact on how those turn out. The next thing we have is industry factors. The demand for car loans, inventory competition will all lead to changes in the number of people who default, how much money you collect before they default, and what you're going to get for the car if you happen to be able to find it. And the last thing are exogenous factors. That's just a nice pretentious statistical term that means things on the outside, right? So we know the economic cycle will have an impact. The economic cycle is not the same thing as a credit cycle. People use that interchangeably, but the economy doesn't have to be tanking for there to be issues in the credit markets. The capital markets, the availability of capital will have an impact. And then the regulatory environment, more recently in Canada, the predatory lending rate, legislation was passed to lower that. So I believe that goes into effect this year. But that will have an impact as well on some lenders. The punchline in all of this is that lenders have failed to embrace a holistic approach, not just what's going on in your building, but 360 degrees, looking at the entire ecosystem of credit. If you fail to look at it that way, you're in danger of severe performance shocks, which could impact your debt lines if you happen to have them. It could impact your portfolio. It could cause you to trip covenants or triggers and put your entire operation at risk. So it's very important. Lenders in subprime and prime, if you look over the last 25 or 30 years, credit performance has oscillated around a baseline for prime lenders and subprime lenders in a very manageable range. You know, in bad times it gets worse, in good times it gets better, obviously. But it's very important for you to know your baseline. So typically for subprime lenders, they will average, depending on their business model, the niche they play in, somewhere between a 5% and a 10% annualized net credit loss. Some of you may happen to be in subprime, that'll be a little higher or lower, depending on your business model. In prime, it's a lot tighter, usually a 0.25% annualized net loss to 0.75% annualized net loss. And so, you know, each lender is going to have a slightly different take on that, but it's very important for you to know in normal, undisturbed times, at baseline period of time, and if you want to know how do you identify a baseline period of time, feel free to talk to me after this if you like that. But you want to know where you are. What is the expectation? The other thing you ought to know is it's going to move off of that quite frequently. So if you don't know where you are in relation to your baseline, it's going to be very hard to manage your portfolio in a timely manner if things start changing. So there are pressures that will exaggerate your losses above or below that line. Some of those pressures are competition. In 2014 and 15, there were a number of good-sized, multi-billion-dollar subprime private equity-backed auto lenders. Well, the thing with private equity, they want to flip the house. They typically want to be in 3 to 5 years, you know, get 3+ times their money and get out. Well, most of them weren't able to do that. The only one that really did that during that cycle was KKR, who invested in Santander and was able to take them public. But chasing volume leads to lenders giving away price and credit or both, which leads to worse performance and leads to yield compression. You think about the other way, you say, well, I'm not one of those people who chase the volumes. We're a rational lender. You may be, but if your program is out of market, you're going to land the deals that the dealer can't place anywhere else. You're going to have adverse selection and see worse performance. And I see that all the time. Lenders have had a very consistent program, very disciplined underwriting and verification, and they still run into these problems. The next are vehicle inventory fluctuations. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this point. Now, just so you know, I will put a lot of things in a slide deck that I couldn't possibly have time to cover. So I'm going to give you the Coles Notes for Americans as Cliff Notes. I'll give you the Coles Notes version of this. And there's an appendix in this deck. So if you want this deck, I can get it to you, or Inovatec can get it to you. And there's some very practical action items that I put in there. But I'll gloss over some of this. I don't need to spend a lot of time on inventory because you all know that. You know, the vehicle prices went through the roof. You may have historically been funding a $20,000 car. Then you find yourself funding a $35,000 or $40,000 car. You have consumers from prime all the way down to subprime that are in record payment sizes. Well, if you think back to the subprime mortgage crisis in the U.S., you had a lot of consumers that were in really aberrant structures, you know, jumbos, you had adjustable rate mortgages. Well, the historical credit data by FICO score for that performance by score, for example, they didn't relate to this. We'd never seen that before. So that historical data is really worthless in trying to predict how someone in payment sizes that we've never seen before are going to perform. And we also know that what goes up comes down, inventory is coming back, and it's going to put, well, your people will be in more appropriate payment sizes and amount of finance levels. It's also going to put pressure on recoveries as those values come back down. So that's going to cause problems. Capital market fluctuations. There are some banks like Ally. Most banks are not using debt facilities or securitization. But for the rest of us, whether it's an OEM, a manufacturer finance company, if it's an independent finance company, use leverage. And typically, if 80 to 85% of that is debt. If I've got a $100 million portfolio, $100 million portfolio, a good 85 million of that is somebody else's money. So pressures in the capital markets will cause your funding to shrink. It'll have an impact on competition. When there's excess of capital, you get a lot of new competition, and it causes people to chase volume. So that'll have an impact. Economic factors, again, this is not something that should be a shocking, controversial point that I make. The problem is people look at unemployment. Canadian unemployment is very low right now. You've got a growing population, wages growing, as Bill yesterday in the Equifax presentation, great presentation, as he pointed out. But there are other things that come into play. That's a lagging indicator. By the time you see unemployment go up, you're also seeing your losses go up. And you've got a bubble in the pipeline. Think about a pig working its way through the body of a python. You've got that waiting to happen, and it's really too late to do anything about those loans. All right. So I'm going to take a moment here just to kind of illustrate history. And this is from Fitch Ratings, so it's U.S. bond data. But it closely parallels the Canadian market. So in Canada, you've got somewhere between 100 and 130 billion in a normal period in auto loans that are financed each year. It's around 700 in the U.S., but the patterns are very closely related to each other. So when you look at this, you see the baseline. This is subprime data, but it's very applicable to prime. I could put prime data up here. The difference is for prime lenders, banks, you got a lot less margin for error. With subprime, you have a lot more margin for safe error. But what that does is it lulls lenders into a false sense of confidence that everything's going to be fine. They don't need to get ahead of things. So when you look at this, you see the ups and downs. This is the average annualized net loss rate in the red. The blue is that same trend, but it shows the seasonality. In each one of these cases, things are worse in the fourth quarter and they're better in the second quarter. That's the same for the U.S. as well as Canada. You see some other factors in here. For example, recovery rates back in 2003, you had OEMs trying to move cars and they were giving employee pricing. You also had rental car companies dumping their fleets. So in January, February of 2003, recovery rates tanked. That lasted for about 3 or 4 months and it came up. Another interesting thing on this, you'll see these peaks here in 2003 and 2009, those were post-recession, but the peaks of the losses happened in those periods during those recessions. What's interesting, if you break it down by a static pool, the losses in this peak were originated 2 years earlier when you thought times were good, and everybody says, happy days are here, we're going to just crank up volume. So what recessions do is they don't tend to really cause defaults, they expose the weakness in your underwriting when you thought times were good. So there's a few other items in here. You see the ramp up in private equity-backed subprime, and what happened in 2017, a lot of these lenders were tripping delinquency triggers, so they had to cut volume to live within their means, and some of those are very public information. Exeter, my former company, and you saw a company called Flagship, another one called First Investors, which is now Stellantis. But all of those grew $1 billion in a single year. And then all of that caught up to them 24 months later, and they had to cut volume. What you saw actually in 18 and 19, before the pandemic, is you saw performance actually improve, but it's a lagging indicator. All right, enough of this. It's a very complicated chart, and I'm getting dizzy looking at it, so I'm going to move on to the next thing. The problem of credit scotoma. Some of you may be saying, Daniel, why do you use a word like that? Is it just that you're pretentious and you're looking for filler for your slides? That's ridiculous and only partly true. The reason I use it is scotoma is the medical term for blind spot. Where your optic nerve goes into your eye, there are no photoreceptors there. So if you look at this, if you were to take a piece of paper in front of you and put an L and an R 15 centimeters apart, if you hold your hand over your right eye and then your left eye looks at the R, the L will disappear. And the same thing happens vice versa. It's a blind spot. The reason I started off with scotoma is there's some well-meaning, sensitive, but poorly informed people that think, they call this ableist language. This is a slight on visually impaired people, and we shouldn't use such language. Well, actually, this is a very good term. All mammals, all people have the issue of scotoma or a blind spot. The reason that's important is no matter your experience in the industry, your educational background, your success over time, we all have these things. So it's important to know it. Many of you years ago U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld at the beginning of the first Gulf War. He's a love-or-hate kind of guy, right? But he had this goofy press conference where they were asking a question. He said, well, there are knowable knowables, there are knowable unknowables, there are unknowable knowables. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Some of you aren't as old as I am. But what he was saying is, in wartime, there are things that we know. There are things that we're aware of, but we don't know the answer. And then there are things that we aren't aware of, but we can know, and then things that we can't know. So he's saying you have to take an inventory of all that. And while that was a very goofy statement he made, very awkward, it actually is very relevant when you think about managing a lender, because we have blind spots. And the sources of those blind spots, I got to check my time. I don't want to cut into our panel time. I'm actually doing pretty good. All right, sources of blind spots. Like I said before, the punchline of this: failure to get ahead of emerging credit issues in a timely manner put your credit facilities and your business at risk. The number one reason auto lenders go out of business is not that their portfolios don't make money. It's that they don't get ahead of problems soon enough to affect change before they cause other problems. And so I could stop there. That's really what the issue is. However, we're going to get into more detail. Blind spots generally come from two sources: management using a business as usual strategy, which is what I've been doing this for a long time, and what I got yesterday I'm going to get tomorrow. Now, a lot of lenders, most of the things I talked about that influence your baseline, most of you are probably saying, yeah, I know that. You probably do. But do you have sufficient reporting and tracking and early warning indicators to say, look, before I get too far off course, I've got to know that the ship is drifting? Do you have early enough warnings so that you can take practical steps in your operations to make sure you don't run into problems? That's the second spot, are the smart guys. Now, I've been involved in analytics. I manage the credit risk group at AmeriCredit, which is now GM Financial in the US and Canada. I was a founder of a company called Exeter Finance in the Dallas area, a national lender. They're about $7 billion now, but from the startup to when I left, we did about $2.5 billion. I spent most of my career as a lender and most of my career developing and managing analytic teams. And the smarter they are, the bigger the blind spots. It's hard to teach somebody who thinks they know everything that they might not know something. Very difficult. But the problem that analytics people have and risk people, whether it's internal or with a vendor, is that they tend to often rely on form over substance. Look at how cool my solution is. And then they tend to err on the side of over complexity. We're going to talk about why that's a problem. Management blind spots. This is the first one. Unconventional management wisdom. Auto lenders tend to start from one of three sources. You have the ones that tend to be the most successful are people that came from big lenders, but they have blind spots. They start a new auto finance company. This is what I had. We tripped over ourselves so many times. There were 4 of us at the beginning. There were probably 1,500 people when I left. But we had this, we thought, hey, we're pretty smart guys, right? We had all this infrastructure of a very well-developed company that all of a sudden, when we're out on our own, there's no net, there's no safety wire. We don't have that support of that infrastructure. The other mistake that managers from big lenders make is there are 3 sources of expense for any lender. You have your cost of funds, your operating expense, and your credit losses, right? So if you have 100 basis points of losses or operating expense, it doesn't matter. It's all coming off the bottom line. But what happens is lenders say, I work for this company, now I'm over here, and they're going to try to replicate what they had at the old company. But you don't have that lender's efficiencies, economies of scale, their cost of funds, their operating expense, all of those things. And so they try to replicate something in a structure that doesn't work for them. Now you have many lenders that start out of a dealership group. They want to finance some of their own sales, and then they want to do loans for other. There are many, many lenders that start out in that fashion. They can be very, very successful if they're disciplined and consistent. But the problems they tend to run into is they overvalue the car over all things. The car and the structure and the skin of the game. Those are all important, but there are other more important things we'll talk about. The third group, this tends to be the least successful group, are ones where somebody was very bright, very talented, maybe even very quantitative in another industry. They were a deal person, they work for a PE firm, they're in some other area of finance, and they jump in auto and say, I know how to do this. Well, a lot of these guys tend to be Jedis on a spreadsheet with great forecasts and pro formas, and then those things don't work out because the operations of the business, taking care of their dealers, servicing that properly, there are a lot of things they think are pedestrian, they aren't paying attention to, and that causes them to run into problems. But here's some things I'll talk about quickly. Mistakes people make, and I hear this all the time from our clients. My volume, I'm at a low scale. I'm a small company, I've got a small number of dealers. I tend to have a higher share of that dealer's business than other lenders. And what happens is these lenders, they tend to, because they're taking care of these dealers, and the dealers are taking care of them, when they're small, they get better performance than they should. And let's just use FICO score as a common frame of reference. 500, 550, 600. They're getting better performance than you would if you had a larger company doing that same business because of those dealer relationships. When they scale, they think they're going to get the same answer. It's really hard to be up close and personal with 1,000 dealers. And so what they find is their credit starts to deteriorate and they run into issues. The second thing is, my performance in this province is going to be just the same if I take, we're going to use subprime for again, but it's the same for prime. I'm in BC or Alberta. The Ontario market is entirely different and far more competitive. You're not going to get the same answer in that market, particularly as you're getting established. So people think they're going to get the same thing when they expand. Another one is, we've had tight controls. We never do anything wrong. Everything's tight. We verify everything. We know everybody's income, and we're very, very happy, proud of ourselves. Well, you can do that, but that ecosystem will descend on you and will impact your performance. The last thing is, I've got a good car and structure. My performance is going to be fine. I'm going to venture to say that none of the cars that were funded in your portfolio have ever made the payment for the customer. It starts with the quality of the customer. Now, some of you in prime may be offended and say, what are you talking about? If your losses vary between 0.25% and 0.5%, yeah, obviously the severity of those losses is going to have a bigger impact. I do understand that. But it's very important, particularly if I've got a customer that has a 30% chance of default, and I get a 50% recovery rate, which would be great. No skips and a 50% recovery rate. Now you go from a 30% default rate to a 15% net. But if I don't recognize that I have a customer with a 10% risk, far better risk, I could lose the car, they never make a principal payment, and I've got a 10% net loss, I'm better off. And what happens is lenders will do a pass-fail on the quality of the consumer and focus exclusively on the structure and the vehicle. Well, that's fine, but you're going to overprice the better paper. That better paper goes somewhere else and you're stuck with the worst paper. And your efficiencies go down because you're getting a lot of apps that you're not funding. So the moral of the story here, managers have to be sensitive to these shifts because those shifts will lead to poor performance before it's possible to fix. Now, to know, a lot of you may say, Daniel, I know all this stuff. What you're saying is obvious and it makes sense. And I hope you're saying that on some level. But to know and not to do is not to know. And what we see, and you've seen it over the last couple of years, as inflation rose in 22 and into 23, you saw lenders, some of them are clients, I had an OEM, a manufacturer, lender in the US, prime paper, were completely shocked at what happened when inflation went up, and it affected the consumer's ability to make the payment. So you saw very smart lenders. That particular lender was on their 7th generation of custom scoring models built by reputable vendors. The last two are us, at least I think they're reputable. But they didn't make changes, they were being disciplined, but the outside environment had a substantial impact on them. And they're publicly traded, so that's bad news when you're publicly traded and everybody can see it, right? So the issue here is that the management blind spot is that they tend to have too much confidence in yesterday. And they fail to put early warning systems in place. They may be aware that the economy has an impact. We're aware that the supply of vehicles will have an impact. But what are you looking at that gives you early enough lead time to do something about it? So I'm going to go to this next slide, but the last bullet here is that it typically takes, there we go, it typically takes 12 to 24 months before you're able to detect on a single pool of loans, let's just say January of 23, whatever you booked in January 23. This is Santander Consumer USA, which is the subprime paper that was originally done by Santander. You know, when they became a bank, and it was the old Drive Financial, when they became a bank and then went public, you know, the regulators are all over them about credit quality. They're a fine organization. I know a lot of those folks. It's a very small industry. But if you look at this, these are all individual pools of loans, right? Now they're aggregated by year. You can do this by month. But look at this where look at about 6 to 9 months in. You've got pools here, 6 to 9 months in, from an individual period. Some of these ended up with a 6% Q net loss. Others from the same period, they're on top of each other, a lot of these pools. So you don't know that early on that what you funded in January, it's now June, there's not enough time. These loans don't all go bad on the first day. it takes you at least a 2-year period to see the trajectory that those are on. So by the time you know that you've been booking garbage, you've got 12 to 24 months of that in the pipeline that has yet to go through, and there's not much you can do about it. A little bit of increased aggression or pulling things forward on the timing and servicing might help you, but probably not going to make a giant impact. Now, if you look at this on a static pool delinquency basis, I take, what about one payment past due? Let's say you have a 4-day grace period, and it's 5 to 30 days you're measuring against one payment past due. You'll run those same charts and you'll see a very similar thing. 6 months in, you have a lot of pools that are on top of each other, but they end up in completely different places. So you've got to have something that gives you more lead time. Now think about this. That's one pool. If I've got $1 billion portfolio, how much of these new pools is it going to take to influence the big pool? Because when you're funding a lot of volume, particularly if you're growing, those new loans have not had a chance to go delinquent yet. So it actually dilutes your delinquency and loss if you're not running static pools and you're just looking at the portfolio at a top-down level, right? Of all your pools together, it's going to be a long time before you notice you have a problem. So, what do you do about it? There's an appendix where I go into some of these details, but the first thing is lose the comfort zone that what we've been doing is going to be consistent. So the key actions, I have a lot of detail on this. If you have scoring models, use them. I know a lot of folks will have a credit scoring model and they'll use it when they agree with it. That's the same as not having it. There are those that think, there are a billion factors that go into underwriting a loan. I still believe a score can do that. Well, there's a reason why the largest and most successful lenders are doing that. The score is not everything. There's plenty. You've got to have a good credit policy. You've got to have solid funding and verification, no doubt. It's one piece of a larger puzzle. But I would recommend you use them. Now, a lot of folks don't rely on them because they talk to their internal risk people or the quantitative people, and they don't believe that those people have a good understanding of the big picture of the business. So they tend to err on the side of not relying on them. So you've got to find a way to bridge that gap. The simplest thing is try to get those people to have some operational experience. The next thing is simplify your credit policy and exceptions. We were engaged to help bring automation to a subprime lender out of Edmonton, and they had a 75-page credit policy manual describing all of their 6, 7, or 8 tiers. No underwriter could possibly follow the level of complexity. Now, what they often did was when the dealers said, well, everybody else is funding this, and then they changed the policy. So they had a million caveats on every possible rule. We automated it for them. It was a nightmare. We automated, we're trying to help them with scoring, but we automated that. And what happened was they said, well, you did it wrong because my buyers put this in tier 2 and you put it in tier 4. When they audited it, they realized they had horrible execution. We were executing what they had in their policy manual, but their underwriters weren't following it. So you've got to simplify your credit policy, and you've got to track and limit exceptions. The next thing is track your efficiencies. I noticed on Inovatec's Propel board over there, they're talking about improving your book to look. That's important. You have 100 applications you see, typically people will approve 35 and they'll land 5, right? It depends. If you're an OEM, it'll be different. If you're a bank, it'll be different. But the idea is that you want to look at your book to approve rate. Think about it like price elasticity. How many did I land of the ones that I wanted? Typically, a dealer will send something to 3 lenders on average. So if you all have the exact same program, you ought to split that a third, a third, and a third. So looking at those, there's a baseline natural level of book to approve rate that you should have in each credit tier. Your lower ones, your worst tiers ought to have a higher one, and your best tiers ought to have single digits. But you have to track those efficiencies so you know, am I out of market? The next thing is implement advanced tracking and reporting. I'm going to gloss over a few of these things. I have a lot of detail in the deck that I can give you, but one of the things that I'll talk about, and I actually talk about on this next point, you have to decompose the sources of credit deterioration. There are 3 sources of credit deterioration. The types of reporting I'm talking about helps you identify where that's coming from. The first is, in typical time periods, 70% of the credit answer, I don't care if there's a recession or not, 70% of the credit answer is typically what you did at the point of origination. Your buying practices, your verification practices, how competitive you are. Maybe 20% is your collections. I don't mean to disparage anybody here who's over a collections operation, but you're not going to collect deep subprime into prime performance. There's a reasonable range of influence you can have on that. Now, if you're not collecting on prime, you can turn it into subprime very quickly if you're not getting in front of those people. However, there are methods that tell you, is my front end falling apart? Is my back end falling apart? And then I mentioned exogenous or external factors. And that's what we've seen over the last couple of years. Lenders didn't change their program. They were not being overly competitive since the pandemic. But what happened is the economy punched us all in the face, and now you have people that you think it's a 10% PTI, but with the financial pressures they have, it's behaving like an 18% PTI. And what you saw is good lenders, good processes, all experience worse performance. Now, early warning indicators, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, it's this. Even when I'm looking at one payment past due in the early stages, that's not enough. Some of the things we look at are roll from current. What percentage are rolling from paid as agreed to current in the first 3, 4, 5 months on books? Your collectors are not calling up people who are current and saying, no, pay us. That's purely an origination time impact if you see that percentage getting worse. So there are a few reports like that that are important, but here, think about this. If data is predictive of future performance, and it is, or nobody used models, then a statistically meaningful change in that data through the door is your first sign that credit is changing. And so I'm going to talk about this. The purpose of this is not to talk about our products, although I'm happy to do that outside of the context of this. But what you want to do here is have leading indicators. There are plenty of data points for credit inside your business and outside, and then the capital markets, the broader economic and capital market environment that you can track. So an example of this, what you'll see is, let's just take January 18. This is 100,000 subprime loans over a 6-year period. And what you see here, take January 18, this aggregate credit, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, the cool band of air is doing a number on my lungs. So, when I look at January 18, this aggregate credit index, and when you look at let's say a FICO score, you look at a 550. I know some of you have been on the buying desk, have looked at one 550 and you say, this is a dog, I'd never buy this. And then you look at another 550 and say, this should be prime. Or they have good paid auto credit, whatever it is. Credit scoring models are compensatory models. Good things offset bad things. There's a lot of ways to arrive at that score. And what happens when you're getting thousands of apps through the door over time, all those attributes that go into that score, these are measured on 1,000 different attributes that go into that index. What you're seeing is how that's changing. Over time, I'm getting thinner and thinner people at those same credit scores, people with less time since their last delinquency, people that have more credit inquiries. And what you see is that as that number is going down, let's take that, say it's January 18. That is where your credit losses, your net credit losses were 6 months later. So here's where as the index is going down, you're seeing 6 months later what happened to your credit losses. When you look at this spike, you have 12 to 18 months lead time in changes. Now, I'm not suggesting you have something that is tied so tightly that every time a data point changes, you're changing your strategy. It's in conjunction with other reports that say I'm seeing less or deteriorated payment effectiveness, my roll rates are increasing, what's going on with my through the door. You use it in conjunction. The important point on this next slide, it's the same data, but this is a capital markets index. There are a number of external factors that go into that, and there are plenty of data points you can use for free, but I'm just showing you our index because it makes it easy to make the point. So as the growth in capital available to auto lenders is declining, you're seeing the same thing. 6 months later, my losses are going through the roof. So the moral of the story here is that you've got to, as a manager, you may be aware that there are things that influence your performance, but you have to get in front of them quickly enough to be able to affect a change. Now, analytic blind spots. This is my favorite area. Let me check my time here. I better get this done in 5 minutes, so I'll try to be less verbose. Analytic blind spots. One of my favorite quotes to use with analysts. I've had employees that have PhDs that have incredible quantitative background, theoretical mathematics, and others, and they all have these blind spots. And the important thing, what Colin Powell said, is don't be buffaloed by experts and elites. They often possess more data than judgment. They can become so inbred that they produce hemophiliacs who bleed to death as soon as they are nicked by the real world. Some of you may have run into risk people that have created incredibly complex, sophisticated models. I once had a professor who was looking at and it was in a doctoral program, and students from other universities would come in and present their dissertation work. And then for all of the other doctoral students to listen to. And we listened, this guy had like 100 variables in his model. And he was very proud of it. He left, And this professor, very famous professor, is no longer alive, but he said, well, what do you all think of this? And we're all kind of scratching our heads because it had a dizzying amount of complexity. And they said, well, Dr. Bass, what do you think of this? And he said, well, he's got a very sophisticated watch that doesn't tell time. And he went up a lot of that. So with analytic blind spots, here's the problem. Remember Liam Neeson in Taken? You need a very particular set of skills. So there's an intersection of specific skills, and what you want out of your analysts is you want them to have math and stat skills, you want them to have data, computer science skills, and you want them to have a domain knowledge. They understand the business. I would take my analysts and I would make them go sit on the buying desk, and then I would make them go sit in collections for a couple weeks. The data you're modeling got there because of all those influences. It didn't just happen. So you need to understand how dealers, how customers, and even your own people, if your incentives are wrong, can put you together, right? We see a similar thing in collections. I sat in collections years ago, and I saw that if they had spoken to us before, they were very happy to talk to us. Oh yeah, I'm going to get you that payment, we can work something out. If they'd never spoken to us before and didn't realize how much forbearance we gave, they were very hostile, right? So that domain knowledge is very important. What we very often see is you have people, particularly with a strong engineering background, nothing wrong with that, and they have strong math skills. Well, the problem is statistics is very important. Mathematicians look at what's possible. Statisticians look at what's probable. And typically in engineering, computer science, machine learning, they often use what they call formal methods or discrete mathematics. 3 times x is always 3 times x. Well, we live in a world where there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of error. It's a credit's a moving target. And if you don't understand that, it's going to lead to a lot of overfit. So for the sake of time, I'm going to plow through this. The mistakes they make, they overfit models. They fail to remove time-sensitive factors. What I mean is, the performance you got when there was a lot of forbearance and we couldn't repo during the pandemic, that's not going to happen in 2025. So when you're modeling your historical data, you have to take things out that aren't going to repeat. I don't care how sophisticated your method is, machine learning, neural networks, we use those in certain cases. Every one of these sophisticated tools has limitations. There's good uses for it. It's a tool in a toolbox. I can beat a nail in with a wrench, but a hammer is probably a better tool. So each of these tools have an appropriate use. But we see people fail to take things out. The model doesn't know that that's not going to happen tomorrow. You've got to have somebody that has this domain knowledge that can remove that. The next thing is an over-reliance on sophistication and complexity. Another thing, post-underwriting filter. I knew a lender that I'm working with right now, or I know a lender I'm working with right now, that they automated all their decisioning. And they have very sophisticated people who don't have any operations background. So they created a model, but do you know how much stuff those underwriters filtered out? And that's not a state of nature. You can look at, well, all the high LTVs perform really well and all the low LTVs are terrible. Well, the reason is because you only gave the high LTV to a person who was stable and you cut back the deal on the deadbeat. That's not a state of nature. If you take that filter off, your model's going to say, higher LTV will perform better. Well, that's idiotic, obviously. So that's the problem you run into. So in the nature of credit defaults, I'm just going to go into this very quickly. The reasons why people default, lenders have done surveys in the U.S. and Canada for over 25 years, asking the customer, why didn't you make a car payment? Well, I got divorced, I lost my job, bankruptcy. In the U.S., a catastrophic medical issue that they couldn't pay for, or the car stopped working, so they stopped paying on it, right? So the news flash here is that none of that's on the credit report. That you're getting a divorce in 18 months doesn't show up in your credit report. So all of the data that we use, we have thousands of attributes that we use. Each of those 1,000 attributes are a hint of what the real thing is. It's an indirect thing that we're pointing to, but it's not actually the thing. There are hints. So it's very important with all these attributes that you don't overfit the data. And so there's a thing called stochastic processes in statistics. Some of you may have done in Excel, may have done a regression model. You have a couple of inputs and you say, here's the thing I'm measuring, defaulted loans, and number of repos, and number of 30-day past dues, number of paid trades, right? And so you have these inputs, the X's, right? The betas are the coefficient. Well, 3 times this equals such and such probability of default. That's deterministic. What really happens in credit modeling is that these betas, it's not 3. It might be from 1 to 5 over time. The meaning of these inputs, credit inquiries, everybody knows if you're ramping up a bunch of inquiries, that's generally not a good thing. So if you have a lower number of inquiries, that's great. Well, what about coming after a major contraction in the market like the Great Recession? People weren't getting a bunch of inquiries because they knew they couldn't get credit. The market was contracted and capital wasn't there. That doesn't make them good going into a normal period. So what's predictive in one period is not necessarily predictive in another. So there's a couple things I want to point to. Why do lenders fall for this? The big thing out is AI and machine learning. Machine learning is one component under the broader umbrella of AI. Why do they fall for this? Well, there's three things. The appeal to novelty. It's not that it's not good, we use it in certain cases. But there's the appeal to novelty, because it's new, it must be better. The appeal to authority. Well, Elon Musk or Amazon or other smart people have invested in this, or they like what we're doing, that doesn't make it good. The next one is bandwagon. Everyone, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you? Your mother may have told you at one point. So because others are doing it doesn't mean it's good. The other thing is, sometimes lenders don't care, but it looks like a very clever solution, and that's window dressing for their investors. Again, that can give you a problem. Overcoming these blind spots, I'm being told I have 1 minute. You'll have this in the presentation, in the slides, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But the main thing is make sure you have a statistician mixed in with your group. Somebody who understands the concept of error and predictive statistics, and also can help measure and make sure you don't overfit. You want to have a healthy trading budget, and you want to get these people into operation so they get the domain knowledge. For lenders that are building models externally, recommendations are very important from your peers in the industry that you trust. You want to make sure that you hold back data. I have never had when I was a chief risk officer, I never had a vendor come to me and say, yeah, we tested your data and our product, it was terrible. Never heard that in 25 years. So you want to hold back data where the vendor doesn't know the answer to make sure you're getting what you think you're getting. So, looking ahead to 24, I'm not going to cover this because Bill did such a great job, but you've got a lot of positives going on in the Canadian market. And you've got a lot of positives going on in the US market, but there's some negatives. And the biggest negative is that consumers aren't out of the woods yet. By the time it shows up, Bill did a great presentation. Equifax, fine company, all bureaus are. But by the time it shows up in their database, you've already got all that built up in your portfolio, right? So let's just go on. I don't need to talk about the US market because there's like 2 of us here, right? Okay. The consumer is under pressure. Many are making very short-sighted decisions. Many are borrowing against their retirement accounts to keep current. You saw the revolving number go up. You have people that look like they're paying their bills, but they're paying it with revolving debt. That's like cutting checks. It's going to blow up at some point. So they don't look bad. They look like some of your best customers. They will go bad when that debt runs out. They can't pay the bill. So you've got to be aware of that. What I would recommend people do is a couple of recommendations, and I'm going to go over this. I always tend to put too much in this. I apologize. Pay attention to the blind spots that I mentioned. Tighten your debt and income policies. We're probably going to have a soft landing in 2025, but for the next 12 months, you want to put sandbags in for PTI debt or income, right? Because you want to step that down over time, but you want to tighten those policies, particularly in your lower tiers. You want to create a credit policy about people who look good, but they're ramping up that revolving debt. When the market returns to normal with vehicle prices, you want to make sure you're still not approving stuff you wouldn't approve 5 years ago. Taper that down over time, your amount finance and your payment size restrictions, because it's going to come back to normal. And if you're the only one who hasn't adjusted that, the dealers are going to pile your application system with those, and you're going to be the only one funding them. The last thing, I'm going to skip over some of these things. There are areas, for example, in Quebec and Ontario, EV factories, Volkswagen factories. You have pockets of the U.S. where there's great economic activity, Amazon building plants. So most of the risk advice people give is that you've got to cut off all this bad stuff. But that doesn't mean you have to lose volume. You can load balance or counterbalance that by expanding your program in areas that have pockets geographically that have a lot of solid economic activity. So I apologize, I did run a little over, but hopefully you got something out of it. I appreciate everybody's time, and I'll be around if you have any questions on this. Thank you.